and walked away as a WWE Tag Team Champion. That actually happened. Today, we're breaking down WrestleMania 34, what went down on April 8th, 2018 in New Orleans, which matches genuinely delivered, and why the main event became one of the most criticized moments in WrestleMania history. By the end of this episode, you'll have a full picture of what made this show both unforgettable and deeply frustrating. And to help me dig into all of it, I've got someone who has watched this show more times than is probably healthy. Look, I regret nothing. WrestleMania 34 is one of those shows that genuinely rewards a rewatch. Not because it's perfect, but because there's so much happening that you almost can't process it all in one sitting.
Okay, so let's set the scene first. Where did this all go down?
So WrestleMania 34 took place on April 8th, 2018 at the Mercedes-Benz Superdome in New Orleans, Louisiana. And this was actually the second time New Orleans hosted WrestleMania at that venue, the first being WrestleMania XXX back in 2014. So the city has a real history with the event.
And it was a massive show, right? Like, how big are we talking?
Huge. According to the SmackDown Hotel, the reported attendance was 78,133 fans. Wikipedia puts the figure somewhere between 60,000 and 65,000, so there's a bit of a discrepancy depending on the source. But either way, the Superdome was packed, and the card itself had 14 matches total, including 3 on the kickoff pre-show.
14 matches. That's a marathon.
It really is. And this was also the first WrestleMania to feature wrestlers from 3 separate brands at once: Raw, SmackDown, and 205 Live, which hadn't happened since WrestleMania 25 in 2009. So, structurally, it was already a pretty ambitious show before a single bell rang.
So walk me through the big storylines heading into this thing. What were the matches people were actually excited about?
So, the 4 headline matches, according to TJR Wrestling's review by John Canton, were Brock Lesnar defending the Universal Championship against Roman Reigns, AJ Styles defending the WWE Championship against Shinsuke Nakamura, Ronda Rousey teaming with Kurt Angle against Triple H and Stephanie McMahon, and Daniel Bryan returning to the ring after nearly 3 years away, teaming with Shane McMahon to face Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn.
Okay, Daniel Bryan's return, that's a big deal. Can you give some context for people who might not know the backstory?
Yeah, absolutely. So, according to Wikipedia, Daniel Bryan had been absent from in-ring competition for nearly 3 years due to concussions. He was medically cleared to return, and this was his first match back. The crowd reaction was enormous. Bleacher Report described him as, quote, returning to his drop-kicking ways, leaving the crowd abuzz with an in-ring showing for the first time in years. That's not just a wrestling moment, that's a genuinely emotional human story.
Yeah, and I think that's the kind of thing that transcends wrestling fandom. Someone fighting to get back to doing what they love after a serious health scare, that hits differently.
Completely. And then you have Ronda Rousey on the other end of the spectrum, someone making their debut. She was a UFC legend stepping into a completely different performance arena. And according to Bleacher Report, she, quote, began her WWE career in earnest with a home run performance in a wild bit of theater. The match saw her and Kurt Angle defeat Triple H and Stephanie McMahon via submission.
So she submitted Stephanie McMahon in her very first WWE match. That's a statement.
It really is. And the crowd was into it. That match was widely praised as one of the highlights of the night.
All right, so now I have to ask about the moment that I teased at the top, the 10-year-old champion. What actually happened there?
Okay, so this is genuinely one of the most bizarre and delightful things WWE has ever done. Braun Strowman was scheduled to challenge Cesaro and Sheamus for the Raw Tag Team Championship, but he needed a partner. And instead of announcing a surprise superstar, he walked into the crowd and grabbed a 10-year-old kid named Nicholas, who, it turned out, was the son of referee John Cone.
Wait, so the kid was already there because his dad was working the show?
Exactly. And according to Wikipedia, Nicholas became the youngest champion in WWE history that night. They won the titles. A 10-year-old Tag Team Champion at WrestleMania.
That is so absurd and so perfect at the same time.
It's peak WrestleMania energy. And honestly, it's the kind of moment that only works because of the spectacle of the event. You couldn't do that on a random Monday night and have it land the same way.
Okay, let's talk about the matches that people are still talking about for the right reasons. What were the genuine standouts on this card?
So the match that gets brought up most consistently as the best of the night is the Intercontinental Championship triple threat. Seth Rollins versus The Miz versus Finn Balor. Rollins won the title via pinfall, and according to both WWE's official results and Bleacher Report, it was one of the most praised matches on the card.
And then there was the SmackDown Women's Championship match, Charlotte Flair and Asuka, right?
Yes, and that one carries a lot of weight historically. Charlotte Flair retained the SmackDown Women's Championship against Asuka via submission, and in doing so, she ended Asuka's undefeated streak. According to Wikipedia, that match was widely praised. Bleacher Report noted that Flair, quote, ended Asuka's historic streak with an emphatic win. Asuka had been undefeated in WWE for a long time, so this was a genuinely significant result.
So you've got Bryan's return, Rousey's debut, Rollins stealing the show, Flair ending a historic streak. That's a lot of good stuff. And yet the show has this reputation for being mixed. What went wrong?
The main event. Full stop. Brock Lesnar retained the Universal Championship against Roman Reigns, and according to Wikipedia, the match, quote, particularly received heavy criticism and was decried by some as one of the worst main events in WrestleMania history. That's a brutal assessment for the final match of the biggest show of the year.
Why was it so badly received? Was it the match itself or the booking decision?
Both, honestly. The crowd in New Orleans was not behind Roman Reigns as the challenger, and Lesnar retaining meant the crowd left the building on a down note after hours of genuinely exciting wrestling. It's the kind of booking decision that can retroactively color how people remember an entire show.
That's such a frustrating dynamic. Like, you can have an incredible show and then the last thing people experience is a dud, and that's what sticks.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that Wikipedia describes the overall reception as, quote, mixed to positive, with the world title matches specifically getting more negative responses. So it wasn't universally panned, but the main event left a mark.
Let's talk about The Undertaker and John Cena for a second, because that match was apparently impromptu.
Yeah, so according to Wikipedia, The Undertaker defeated John Cena in what was described as an impromptu match. Cena had been shown in the crowd during the pre-show, and then The Undertaker showed up and they had a match. The Undertaker won via pinfall. It was one of those moments that felt spontaneous, even if it clearly wasn't.
WWE loves doing that, making something feel unplanned even when it's been rehearsed for weeks.
It's part of the theater of it. And speaking of theater, the pre-show had some genuinely interesting stuff too. The Cruiserweight Championship Tournament final saw Cedric Alexander defeat Mustafa Ali to win the vacant title. Bleacher Report noted that Alexander actually said, quote, it's WrestleMania, baby. Let's show them, before the match. And they did.
What about the Andre the Giant Memorial Battle Royal? That's always a pre-show staple.
So Matt Hardy won that one, last eliminating Baron Corbin. But Bleacher Report was pretty blunt about it. They gave it a D grade and said it was, quote, a low-energy battle royal with few highlights. The one notable moment was Bray Wyatt appearing to help Hardy, with the two former enemies joining forces. But overall, it wasn't a standout.
A D grade. Ouch.
Yeah, Bleacher Report's Ryan Dilbert didn't pull punches. He noted that WWE went with all mid-carders rather than introducing surprise entrants, which had been a tradition in previous years, so it felt like a missed opportunity.
And there was also a Women's Battle Royal on the pre-show, the first ever WrestleMania Women's Battle Royal, right?
Correct. Naomi won that one, and according to WWE's official results, it was the first ever WrestleMania Women's Battle Royal. The field included names like Sasha Banks, Bayley, Becky Lynch, Carmella, and even some NXT talent like Bianca Belair, Kairi Sane, Dakota Kai, and Peyton Royce. So historically, it's a pretty significant match, even if it was on the pre-show.
Bianca Belair in a WrestleMania pre-show Battle Royal. Wild to think about where she ended up.
That's one of those things that makes going back to old WrestleMania so interesting. You see people in the background who later become the main event. It's like watching an early episode of a show and spotting a character who becomes the lead 3 seasons later.
Okay, so let's zoom out a little. 6 new champions were crowned at this show, according to WWE's official recap. That's a lot of title changes in one night.
It is, and it speaks to how stacked the card was. You had Seth Rollins winning the Intercontinental title, Nia Jax winning the Raw Women's Championship from Alexa Bliss, the Bludgeon Brothers winning the SmackDown Tag Team titles, Jinder Mahal winning the United States Championship in a fatal 4-way over Randy Orton, Bobby Roode and Rusev, Braun Strowman and Nicholas winning the Raw Tag Team titles, and Cedric Alexander winning the Cruiserweight title. 6 new champions.
That's genuinely a lot of momentum shifts in one night. And yet, the main event title didn't change hands.
Right, and that's part of why the main event felt so deflating. The whole show had this energy of change and new beginnings, and then the final match just didn't deliver that. Lesnar retained, walked out, and the crowd was left flat.
Let me push back on something, though. Is it fair to judge the whole show by its main event? Because by the numbers, this card delivered a lot.
That's a fair challenge. And honestly, I think the show deserves more credit than it gets. Bleacher Report described it as, quote, a stacked pay-per-view card brimming with potent matches and moments. The problem is that in wrestling, the main event is the last thing you feel. It's the emotional punctuation mark on the whole night. And if that lands wrong, it colors everything.
It's like a great meal that ends with a bad dessert. You remember the dessert.
Exactly that. And I think that's why the show has this complicated legacy. People who were there or watched live remember the frustration of the main event. But when you go back and look at the card match by match, there's genuinely a lot to appreciate.
And the podcast world clearly agreed. According to Ivy.fm, there were over 413 podcasts and 660 episodes covering WrestleMania 34. That's a show that generated conversation.
Yeah, and that tracks. The Fightful Wrestling podcast with Sean Ross Sapp did a full live review the night of the show, and it pulled 64,000 views on YouTube. The Fightbox podcast brought in a guest specifically to break it down. This was a show that people had opinions about, and they wanted to talk through those opinions.
Which is kind of the mark of a significant event, right? Even if it's divisive, the fact that people are still talking about it says something.
Absolutely. A forgettable show doesn't generate 660 podcast episodes. WrestleMania 34 gave people things to argue about, things to celebrate, and things to mourn. That's a show with substance.
Let's talk about the AJ Styles versus Shinsuke Nakamura match, because that was a dream match on paper. Two of the best in the world going at it for the WWE Championship.
On paper, it was incredible. Both guys had incredible careers in New Japan Pro Wrestling before coming to WWE, so this was a match that fans had been wanting to see for years. AJ Styles retained the WWE Championship via pinfall, but the match itself was considered underwhelming by many. It didn't quite reach the heights people expected, given what both men are capable of.
So even the SmackDown main event had that same issue. Great on paper, didn't fully deliver.
Yeah, and that's a recurring theme with WrestleMania 34. The matches that were supposed to be the biggest didn't always land, while some of the mid-card matches completely over-delivered. Seth Rollins in that triple threat is the clearest example of that.
It's almost like the show was upside down. The undercard was the main event, and the main event was the undercard.
That's a really good way to put it. And it's not the first time that's happened at WrestleMania, but it was particularly pronounced here. The crowd in New Orleans was vocal and passionate, and they responded to what was actually good rather than what was supposed to be good.
Let's talk about the Daniel Bryan and Shane McMahon versus Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn match, because there was a real storyline stakes element to that one.
Right, so the stipulation was that if Owens and Zayn won, they would be rehired to SmackDown Live. They had been fired as part of the storyline. Bryan and McMahon won via pinfall, so Owens and Zayn stayed fired in kayfabe. But the real story was Bryan being back in the ring, throwing those kicks, doing the yes chants with the crowd. According to TJR Wrestling's John Canton, who reviewed the show live and then updated his thoughts in 2022, Bryan's return was one of the most emotionally resonant moments of the entire event.
And it's worth noting that Bryan had been told by doctors he might never wrestle again. So this wasn't just a comeback, it was a comeback that wasn't supposed to happen.
Exactly. Wikipedia notes he had been absent for nearly 3 years due to concussions. So when he came back and the crowd erupted, that was real. That wasn't manufactured emotion. That was a building full of people who genuinely cared about this person getting to do what he loves again.
Okay, so when you step back from everything we've covered, the 14 matches, the 6 new champions, the debuts, the returns, the controversial main event, what does WrestleMania 34 actually represent?
I think it represents the tension that's always at the heart of WrestleMania. The show is so big, so ambitious, that it almost can't help but be uneven. You're trying to serve every audience, every storyline, every brand, and sometimes the pieces don't all fit together perfectly. WrestleMania 34 had some of the most genuinely moving moments in recent WrestleMania history, and it also had what many consider one of the worst main events in the show's history. Both things are true.
And I think that's actually what makes it worth revisiting. It's not a clean story. It's messy and complicated and human in a way that a perfectly executed show sometimes isn't.
Yeah, and the moments that worked, Bryan's return, Rousey's debut, Rollins in that triple threat, the sheer absurdity of a 10-year-old becoming champion, those are the things that stick. The main event fades. The moments that made people feel something, those are what people actually remember.
So here's what this really comes down to. WrestleMania 34 is a show that gave you 6 new champions in one night, a UFC legend making her in-ring debut, a beloved performer returning from what could have been a career-ending injury, and a 10-year-old kid walking out with a championship belt. That's a lot of history packed into one evening.
And the fact that the main event didn't deliver doesn't erase any of that. It just means the show had a complicated ending. But the journey to get there was a lot worth watching.
If someone who had never watched wrestling wanted to understand what WrestleMania is, the spectacle, the emotion, the chaos, could you point them to specific moments from this show?
Absolutely. Show them Daniel Bryan's return and the crowd reaction. Show them Ronda Rousey submitting Stephanie McMahon in her first match. Show them Seth Rollins winning the Intercontinental title in that triple threat. And then show them Braun Strowman pulling a 10-year-old out of the crowd to win a championship. That's WrestleMania. That's the whole thing right there.
And maybe skip the main event.
I mean, watch it once. You should know what happened. But yeah, don't end on it.
That's actually solid advice for a lot of things in life.
Wrestling teaches you a lot if you let it.
Alright, so here's the takeaway from WrestleMania 34.
According to Wikipedia, the show received mixed to positive reviews overall. The world title matches drew the most criticism, but the return of Daniel Bryan, the debut of Ronda Rousey, the Intercontinental Championship triple threat, and the SmackDown Women's Championship match were widely praised. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, a 10-year-old kid became the youngest champion in WWE history. And that kid's dad was working the show as a referee, which means John Cone went to work that night and came home with his son as a WWE champion. That's a story you couldn't write.
Except WWE did write it. And somehow it worked.
That's the magic of WrestleMania. Even when it's chaotic and uneven and frustrating, it produces moments that you genuinely cannot get anywhere else.
And that's what keeps people coming back. Not the perfect shows, the ones that surprise you.
Exactly. Nobody remembers the show where everything went exactly as expected. They remember the night a 10-year-old became champion.
And with that, thanks for joining us on Copilot Podcasts. WrestleMania 34, a show that started with a kid from the crowd winning a title and ended with a main event that divided a fan base. The next time someone tells you wrestling is predictable, remind them about Nicholas.
So, you need your bag. I already did a few. 300 purple, 300 green, 300 blue, 300 red. And equipment, 300 will fit into there.
Got it.
Pilot Podcasts. The biggest show in professional wrestling history once took place in front of 0 fans in a training facility with matches that were filmed days before they aired, and somehow it might have accidentally invented the future of the sport. Today, we're doing a full audio podcast review of WrestleMania 36. By the end of this episode, you'll know exactly what happened across both nights, which matches the wrestling podcast community actually loved, and whether this pandemic-era spectacle is genuinely worth your time to go back and watch. I've got someone here who has gone deep on this one, so let's get into it. What is the first thing people need to understand about WrestleMania 36 before we even talk about a single match?
The context is everything with this one. WrestleMania 36 was originally supposed to happen at Raymond James Stadium in Tampa, Florida. Big outdoor stadium, massive crowd, the whole spectacle. And then mid-March 2020 hits, and all WWE programming gets relocated to the WWE Performance Center training facility in Orlando because of the COVID-19 pandemic. No audience, only essential staff present.
So they just moved the whole thing to a gym, basically.
Essentially, yeah. And not only that, the matches were actually filmed on March 25th and 26th, but the show didn't air until April 4th and 5th. So it wasn't even live, it was a taped event. According to multiple sources, including the Juggernaut Show's Retro Review, WrestleMania 36 was the first major professional wrestling event to be affected by the pandemic, and it's the only edition of WrestleMania in history not to feature a live crowd.
The only one ever out of 36 WrestleManias at that point.
Exactly. And TJR Wrestling's John Canton, who wrote one of the most detailed reviews of this show, a 15,000-word review, by the way, described it as the most unique WrestleMania of them all. He said it was the first time WWE decided to make it a 2-night event, and he actually credited WWE for coming up with that format, even if it was born out of necessity.
Wait, so the 2-night WrestleMania format that we now just take for granted, that started here?
That's what Canton argues. He said, and I'm quoting here, that WWE deserves credit for coming up with the 2-night WrestleMania concept that might be here to stay. So this weird, empty pandemic show may have permanently changed how WrestleMania is structured going forward.
That is a wild legacy for a show that the infamous podcast literally called the emptiest granddaddy of them all.
Ha! Yeah, that episode title is honestly perfect. Brian from the infamous podcast and Julian Brown from Everything is Permitted did a nearly 2-hour review of this show, and that title just nails the vibe. But here's the thing. Even they were asking the right question. Have empty arena shows run their course? And that question is still interesting to think about.
Okay, so let's actually get into the card. 2 nights, a lot of matches. Walk me through night 1 first.
Night 1 was Saturday, April 4th. The pre-show kicked off with Cesaro defeating Drew Gulak. The infamous podcast gave that a 2.5 out of 5 stars. Then on the main card, Alexa Bliss and Nikki Cross defeated the Kabuki Warriors, Asuka and Kairi Sane for the WWE Women's Tag Team Championship. Also 2.5 stars.
So, a pretty average start.
Yeah, and then it got worse before it got better. Elias defeated King Corbin, and that got a 1 out of 5 from the infamous podcast. And then Goldberg versus Braun Strowman for the Universal Championship, also 1 out of 5. The Reddit wrestling community was pretty blunt about that one, too. Someone on the R on WWE discussion thread just said Goldberg losing to last-minute replacement Strowman, meh.
Last-minute replacement? So Strowman wasn't even the original plan?
That's what the community was saying, yeah. Roman Reigns had stepped away from the event due to health concerns related to the pandemic, so Strowman stepped in, and the match itself just didn't land. But here's where night 1 turns around. Becky Lynch defending the Raw Women's Championship against Shayna Baszler got 3.5 out of 5. Sami Zayn defending the Intercontinental Championship against Daniel Bryan also got 3.5.
Okay, so the mid-card was actually solid.
Really solid. And then the latter match, John Morrison defending the SmackDown Tag Team titles against Kofi Kingston and Jey Uso in a triple threat, that got 4 out of 5. But the match of night 1, according to the infamous podcast, was Kevin Owens versus Seth Rollins in a no disqualification match. That got 4.5 out of 5 stars.
KO and Seth in a no DQ match sounds like it would absolutely go off.
It delivered. And then night 1 closed with the Boneyard match, Undertaker versus AJ Styles, with Luke Gallows and Carl Anderson in Styles' corner. The Infamous podcast gave that a 3 out of 4 cinematic stars, which is a separate rating scale they use specifically for the cinematic matches, and that distinction matters.
Right, because those matches were filmed completely differently. They weren't in the Performance Center ring.
Exactly. 2 matches across the whole event were filmed in what the Infamous podcast described as atypical styles outside of a traditional arena setting. The Boneyard match and the Firefly Funhouse match. And those 2 matches are really the defining legacy of this entire show.
Interesting. And the wrestling podcast community was split on them, right? Like, not everyone loved the Boneyard match.
Yeah, that's a fair point. The Wrestling Underground podcast, Chad and Marcus, specifically called out that Chad didn't like the Boneyard match, so it wasn't universally praised. But the Getting Over Wrestling podcast, hosted by Adam Silverstein, described both the Firefly Funhouse match and the Boneyard match as, quote, spectacular and epic, and said they set the internet ablaze.
Set the internet ablaze is a strong phrase. What was the actual reaction on Reddit?
The ROWWE thread had someone say, and I love this, both the Boneyard and Firefly Funhouse movies both exceeded my expectations. I mean, thank God we didn't actually have to watch Taker and Cena wrestle again. Very entertaining. And the listed winner of the Firefly Funhouse match between John Cena and Bray Wyatt in that same Reddit thread? Just the WWE Universe. No winner declared.
Ha! That's actually the most accurate result possible for that match.
It really is. The Firefly Funhouse match was this surreal, cinematic, almost psychological experience. It wasn't a traditional wrestling match at all. And that's kind of the whole tension with WrestleMania 36. It forced WWE to get creative in ways they never would have otherwise.
Okay, let's get into night 2 then. Sunday, April 5th.
Night 2 opened with Liv Morgan defeating Natalya on the pre-show, which got 1 out of 5 from the Infamous podcast. Then, Charlotte Flair defeated Rhea Ripley for the NXT Women's Championship. And the Wrestling Underground podcast's Chad was pretty blunt about that. He said, of course Charlotte won the NXT title, which tells you everything about the fan reaction.
Yeah, Charlotte winning titles is kind of a running theme in WWE.
To put it mildly. Then, Aleister Black defeated Bobby Lashley, Otis defeated Dolph Ziggler, and then, one of the genuine highlights of Night 2, Edge versus Randy Orton in a last man standing match. Someone on the RRWWE thread called it one of the best last man standing matches I've ever seen. Capital letters and everything.
Edge had just come back from retirement at this point, right? So that match had a lot of emotional weight behind it.
Exactly, and that context made it land harder. Edge won that one. Then Rob Gronkowski, yes, the NFL player, won the 24/7 championship from Mojo Rawley, which is its own kind of WrestleMania moment. The Street Profits retained the Raw Tag Team titles. Bayley retained the SmackDown Women's Championship in a 5-way match.
And then the main event of night 2.
Drew McIntyre defeating Brock Lesnar for the WWE Championship. That was the main event. And the Getting Over Wrestling podcast specifically asked the question after the show, will Drew McIntyre prove to be a capable world champion? Which is a fascinating question to sit with now, years later.
And the Firefly Funhouse match was also on night 2. John Cena versus Bray Wyatt.
Yeah, that was the other cinematic match. And the Wrestling Underground podcast's Chad was pretty harsh on it. He said the Firefly Funhouse match was awful. So you've got this real divide in the community. Getting Over called it spectacular. Wrestling Underground called it awful. And Reddit just declared the WWE Universe the winner and moved on.
That divide is actually really interesting to me. Like, what does it say that the same match can get such wildly different reactions?
It says that WrestleMania 36 was genuinely polarizing in a way that most WrestleManias aren't. Most years, the discourse is about whether the card was good or great. With 36, the discourse was about whether what they were watching was even wrestling. The cinematic matches broke the rules of the format entirely.
And that's kind of the whole legacy question, right? The Revisiting the Mania podcast, Carlos and Maria Torres, literally titled their WrestleMania 36 episode, Is the Pandemic Mania Worth Revisiting? That was their question in 2025, 5 years later.
Right, and that's such a good framing. Because the show has this dual identity. On one hand, you've got matches like Elias versus King Corbin getting 1 out of 5 stars, and Goldberg versus Strowman getting 1 out of 5. On the other hand, you've got Kevin Owens versus Seth Rollins at 4.5 out of 5, and 2 cinematic matches that genuinely changed how people think about what a wrestling match can be.
The combined runtime of the 2 main shows was 6 hours and 25 minutes, according to TJR Wrestling. That is a lot of content to sit through.
6 hours and 25 minutes with no crowd noise, no reactions, just wrestlers performing in an empty building. That is a genuinely strange viewing experience, and it's part of why the podcast community had so much to say about it. The PW Torch Roundtable, Wade Kelly, Mitchell, specifically asked whether WWA pulled off the event from an aesthetic standpoint given the constraints. That's the right question.
And what was their answer?
That roundtable was a VIP audio episode, so the full verdict isn't public. But the fact that they were asking the aesthetic question tells you something. The constraints were real. No crowd energy, no atmosphere in the traditional sense. The matches that worked were the ones that leaned into the weirdness rather than fighting it.
Which is exactly what the Boneyard match and the Firefly Funhouse match did.
Precisely. And that's the counterintuitive thing about WrestleMania 36. The matches that tried to be normal wrestling matches in an empty arena were the ones that felt the most hollow. The matches that said, okay, we're making a movie now, were the ones that actually connected.
That's a really sharp observation. Like, the pandemic forced a creative constraint that accidentally produced something new.
And the Don Tony and Kevin Castle show did a nearly 3-hour audio recap of this event, 2 hours and 50 minutes, which tells you how much there was to unpack. That's not a show you do for a forgettable WrestleMania. That's a show you do for something that genuinely demands conversation.
Okay, I want to push back on something though, because the infamous podcast was asking whether empty arena shows had run their course. And at the time, WWE was doing all their shows without crowds. So was WrestleMania 36 actually good, or did it just benefit from low expectations?
That's a fair challenge, and I think the honest answer is both. The bar was low because the circumstances were unprecedented, but some of what happened on that show would have been impressive under any circumstances. Kevin Owens versus Seth Rollins at 4.5 out of 5 stars is not a low expectations rating. That's a genuinely great match.
And the ladder match getting 4 out of 5.
Right. John Morrison, Kofi Kingston, Jey Uso in a triple threat ladder match. That's a legitimately good match regardless of the setting. The problem is that those matches are sandwiched between some real low points. And the Reddit community was pretty honest about that. The comment about John Morrison winning some strange singles match for the tag titles while making Jimmy and Kofi look dumb as hell, that's a real criticism.
So the card was wildly uneven.
Wildly uneven. And that's actually pretty consistent with how most WrestleManias go. You get highs and lows. The difference with 36 is that the highs were genuinely novel and the lows felt especially flat without a crowd to carry them.
The Revisiting the Mania podcast framed it as a question of whether certain moments still hold up and which ones should stay in the past. That's a good way to think about it.
Carlos and Maria Torres on that show had a really interesting dynamic for reviewing it. Carlos as the longtime wrestling fan, Maria as a first-time viewer. And that's actually a useful lens for WrestleMania 36 specifically, because a first-time viewer wouldn't have the baggage of knowing what WrestleMania is supposed to feel like. They'd just be watching the matches on their own terms.
And for a first-time viewer, the Boneyard match and the Firefly Funhouse match would probably be the most memorable things on the card.
Almost certainly, because they're the most visually distinct. They look like nothing else in wrestling. The Boneyard match is essentially a horror movie short film. The Firefly Funhouse match is this surreal psychological trip through John Cena's career. Neither of them looks like a wrestling match.
And yet they're the things people are still talking about years later.
Exactly. The Getting Over Wrestling podcast described the Firefly Funhouse match and the Boneyard match as the things that set the internet ablaze. And that's not hyperbole. Those two matches generated more discussion than almost anything else on the card.
Even though one of them had a disputed winner.
Ha, yeah. Bray Wyatt technically won the Firefly Funhouse match, but the way it played out was so abstract that the Reddit community just threw up their hands and said the WWE Universe won. Which is kind of the point. It wasn't about winning and losing. It was about the experience.
Okay, so stepping back from the individual matches, what does the podcast community consensus actually look like on this show? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it just historically significant?
I think the honest consensus is historically significant, creatively uneven, and worth watching selectively. The Getting Over Wrestling podcast called it a must-listen episode for their recap, which suggests they thought the show had enough to talk about. The Infamous podcast spent nearly 2 hours on it. Don Tony and Kevin Castle spent nearly 3 hours. That's not the response you get to a show people want to forget.
But the Wrestling Underground podcast was pretty critical. Becky Lynch's shortcomings, didn't like the Boneyard match, called the Firefly Funhouse awful.
And that's a legitimate perspective. Chad from Wrestling Underground represents the fan who wanted a real WrestleMania and felt like they got a compromise. And that's a valid reaction. If you were a fan who had been looking forward to Raymond James Stadium, to 70,000 people, to the full spectacle, what you got instead was genuinely a lesser version of that in terms of atmosphere.
So the show is almost like a Rorschach test. What you think of it depends on what you were expecting.
That's a really good way to put it. If you came in expecting a traditional WrestleMania, you were probably disappointed. If you came in curious about what WWE could do under impossible constraints, you probably found things to appreciate. And if you came in 5 years later with no expectations at all, like Maria Torres on the Revisiting the Mania podcast, you might have found it genuinely entertaining.
The Revisiting the Mania episode on WrestleMania 36 ran 1 hour and 44 minutes, by the way. That's a long episode for a show that's supposed to be asking whether something is worth revisiting.
Which kind of answers the question, doesn't it? If it wasn't worth revisiting, you don't spend 1 hour and 44 minutes on it. The show has enough texture, enough controversy, enough genuinely interesting moments that it generates conversation even years later.
And TJR Wrestling's John Canton wrote nearly 15,000 words reviewing it. That's a short novel.
15,000 words. He described the combined length of the two main shows as 6 hours and 25 minutes of content. And he said, WWE deserves praise for even putting on this show as well as they did. That's a pretty generous read, but it's also fair. The logistics of pulling off WrestleMania during a global pandemic, with no crowd, in a training facility, were genuinely difficult.
And they still managed to produce 2 matches that people are calling cinematic landmarks in wrestling.
That's the thing. The Boneyard match and the Firefly Funhouse match didn't just happen in spite of the pandemic, they happened because of it. Without the empty arena, without the need to do something different, those matches probably don't exist in that form. The constraint created the creativity.
So picture this. It's the biggest night in professional wrestling. Tens of thousands of fans are packed into a stadium for the first time in over a year, and then nothing. A weather delay stops WrestleMania dead in its tracks before a single match even happens. That's how WrestleMania 37 kicked off. And honestly, it set the tone for one of the most unpredictable events in recent memory. Today, we're breaking down WrestleMania 37, specifically the historic moments that made Night 1 genuinely groundbreaking, the matches that delivered and the ones that really didn't, and what the massive podcast community response tells us about why this event still matters. My co-host has been deep in the weeds on this one, so let's get into it. What's the first thing people need to understand about WrestleMania 37?
The context is everything here. WrestleMania 37 happened on April 10th and 11th, 2021 at Raymond James Stadium in Tampa, Florida. And the reason that location matters is actually kind of wild. This event was originally supposed to be at SoFi Stadium in Inglewood, California, but COVID-19 restrictions in California forced WWE to move it. And Tampa was the backup plan.
Wait, so Tampa was literally the backup venue?
It was. And here's the kicker. Tampa was actually the originally planned venue for WrestleMania 36 the year before the pandemic forced that event to be held behind closed doors at the WWE Performance Center with 0 fans. So, in a weird way, Tampa finally got its WrestleMania.
That's a strange full circle moment. So this was genuinely the first time WWE had ticketed fans at an event during the pandemic?
According to Wikipedia, yes, it was the first time WWE had ticketed fans in attendance during the COVID-19 pandemic. The last event with fans before this was NXT on March 11th, 2020. So there was over a year of empty arenas before WrestleMania 37 brought the crowd back.
And the attendance numbers, how big was this crowd actually?
So WWE claimed a combined attendance of 51,350 across both nights, but Wikipedia notes that was disputed. The actual number of tickets sold was reportedly around 20% lower than WWE's claimed figures. The verified numbers from Wikipedia put Night 1 at 17,946 and Night 2 at 18,501, for a combined actual attendance of about 40,806.
Still a massive crowd though, especially after a year of empty arenas.
Absolutely. And TJR Wrestling's John Canton put it really well in his review. He said, WrestleMania 37 was a big deal because it was the first time WWE was in front of a big crowd of fans for the first time in over a year. The wrestlers feed off those reactions. That energy was genuinely palpable.
So let's talk format. This was a 2-night event. How did that break down?
14 matches total, evenly split between the 2 nights, 7 per night. And unlike previous years, there were no matches on either night's kickoff pre-show. Everything was on the main card. Hulk Hogan and Titus O'Neil hosted both nights.
And this was also the first WrestleMania on Peacock, right?
Exactly. Following the merger of the WWE Network under Peacock in March 2021, WrestleMania 37 became the first major WWE event where American subscribers could only live stream via Peacock. That was a significant shift for how fans accessed the product.
Okay, so now let's get into the actual show. Night 1, walk me through what happened.
Night 1 opened with Vince McMahon on the stage with most of the roster behind him, welcoming fans back. TJR Wrestling noted the fans popped big for it. Then BB Rexa sang America the Beautiful. And then, weather delay. Michael Cole had to announce it at ringside. First time in WrestleMania history.
A weather delay at WrestleMania. That's genuinely unprecedented.
PW Torch editor Wade Keller actually covered the handling of that rain delay specifically in his audio review. He talked about the unscripted interviews they did during the delay to fill time. It was one of those moments where you could see WWE improvising in real time.
Okay, so once the show actually got going, what were the standout matches on night 1?
The show kicked off with Bobby Lashley defending the WWE Championship against Drew McIntyre. According to the official WWE results and the SmackDown Hotel's match card, Lashley retained via submission with help from MVP. It set a physical tone for the night.
And then there was the Bad Bunny match, which I feel like people were skeptical about going in.
Right, and it ended up being one of the most talked about moments of the whole event. Bad Bunny and Damian Priest defeated The Miz and John Morrison. The Fightful Wrestling Podcast, with Sean Ross Sapp, Robert DeFelice, Alex Pawlowski, and Jeremy Lambert, specifically highlighted Bad Bunny as a major talking point in their Night 1 review. The Revisiting the Mania podcast also called it Bad Bunny's breakout moment.
A Latin music superstar having a breakout moment at WrestleMania is not a sentence I expected to say.
And yet here we are. Cesaro also defeated Seth Rollins on Night 1, which got a lot of positive attention. AJ Styles and Omos, in Omos' debut, defeated the New Day's Kofi Kingston and Xavier Woods to win the Raw Tag Team Championships. Braun Strowman defeated Shane McMahon in a steel cage match.
So Night 1 had a lot going on, but the main event is where things got historic.
This is the one. Bianca Belair defeated Sasha Banks to win the SmackDown Women's Championship. And according to Wikipedia, this was the first time 2 African Americans headlined WrestleMania. It was also only the second time women headlined the event at all, after WrestleMania 35 in 2019.
That's genuinely massive cultural milestone, and it sometimes gets overshadowed by the Roman Reigns triple threat on Night 2.
It really does. CBS Sports described it as an incredible main event. They said Night 2's main event was a worthy follow-up to the incredible main event from Night 1, where Bianca Belair won the SmackDown Women's Championship in a war with Sasha Banks. That framing says a lot. Night 1's main event set the bar.
Okay, let's move to Night 2. What's the first thing that stands out?
Honestly, the Fiend match. And not entirely for good reasons. Randy Orton versus The Fiend Bray Wyatt, the entrance was spectacular. Alexa Bliss cranked a giant jack-in-the-box next to the ring. The Fiend dove off it, hit Orton with a clothesline. CBS Sports said the pre-match spectacle of The Fiend's entrance was great.
But then the match itself?
CBS Sports graded it a C-. Their review said the match itself didn't really do much before the sudden, very odd ending. Fire shot from the ring posts, black goo ran down Alexa Bliss's face. The Fiend got distracted, Orton hit the RKO and won. The WWE podcast called it massively disappointing.
So the entrance was a 10, the match was a 4.
Pretty much. And it's a recurring theme in wrestling. The spectacle can completely outshine the actual in-ring work. The Fiend's character was built on atmosphere and dread, and when the match didn't deliver on that, it felt like a letdown.
What else happened on Night 2 that actually delivered?
Rhea Ripley defeating Asuka for the Raw Women's Championship was a big one. Apollo Crews won the Intercontinental Championship from Big E in a Nigerian drum fight. That's a stipulation match. Sheamus defeated Riddle for the United States Championship. And Kevin Owens defeated Sami Zayn, with Logan Paul as a special guest at ringside. And according to the official WWE results, Owens then hit a stunner on Logan Paul after the match.
Kevin Owens stunning Logan Paul is very on brand for WrestleMania.
It really is. And then the main event. Roman Reigns defending the Universal Championship against both Edge and Daniel Bryan in a triple threat match. CBS Sports called it a thrilling match, men coming within inches of winning. Jey Uso got involved multiple times trying to help Reigns, and Reigns ultimately retained.
CBS Sports said it was an all-time main event, right?
Their headline literally called it an all-time main event. Brent Brookhouse wrote that for the second consecutive night, WrestleMania 37 received a main event worthy of the biggest stage in professional wrestling. That's high praise.
So both nights delivered on the main event front. That's actually pretty rare for a two-night event.
It is. And the W2M Network's review with Chris Sheehan and Mark Rowdelich actually debated whether WrestleMania should even be 2 nights or 1. That's a real conversation in the wrestling community. 2 nights means more matches, but it also means more filler potential.
That's a fair debate. More content isn't always better.
Exactly. And the podcast community really dug into that question. The Pro Wrestling Illustrated podcast, hosted by PWI senior writer Al Castle and contributing writer Brian Solomon, did a match-by-match, segment-by-segment review they described as a supersized episode. They covered everything from celebrity appearances to major title changes.
How big is the podcast response to WrestleMania 37 overall? Like, is this a niche thing or is it massive?
According to Ivy.fm, there are over 520 podcasts and 807 episodes covering WrestleMania 37. The average episode duration is 1 hour and 13 minutes. That's an enormous amount of audio content dedicated to a single event.
Wait, 520 podcasts? That's not a niche. That's a whole ecosystem.
It really is. And the top shows covering it include W2M Network with 12 episodes, the RCWR Show with Lee Sanders at 10 episodes, What Culture Wrestling with 6, Pios Wrestling with John Pollock and Wai Ting at 5, and Busted Open with 4. These are established wrestling media outlets, not just random fans.
And there's even a podcast that revisited it years later, the Revisiting the Mania podcast.
Yeah, that one's interesting. It featured a longtime wrestling fan named Carlos and a first-time viewer named Maria, breaking down the entire 2-night event to decide which matches are worth watching and which ones you can skip. That framing, veteran fan versus newcomer, is a really smart way to make the content accessible.
It's like a built-in guide for people who weren't watching in 2021.
Exactly. And that's part of what makes WrestleMania 37 interesting as a subject. It has this dual identity. In the moment, it was about the return of fans and the historic Belair Banks main event. But looking back, it's also a snapshot of WWE at a specific transitional moment. New streaming platform, post-pandemic crowd, Roman Reigns cementing his tribal chief character.
The Roman Reigns character work is something that keeps coming up. He retained the title, but it sounds like the story around the match was almost as important as the match itself.
Completely. CBS Sports noted that Jey Uso found his way into the match on several occasions, trying to give Reigns an upper hand. Paul Heyman was at ringside. The whole tribal chief narrative was in full swing. Roman wasn't just winning, he was dominating with a whole apparatus around him.
And that's what separates a good WrestleMania match from a great one. The storytelling layered on top of the in-ring work.
Right. And that's also why the Orton-Fiend match disappointed so many people. The story going in was compelling, Orton had set the Fiend on fire months earlier, and this was the reckoning. But the match didn't pay that off in a satisfying way. The ending felt abrupt and strange.
The WWE podcast specifically called it massively disappointing. That's a strong word.
It is, and it reflects a real frustration. When you build a character like the Fiend on the premise that he's essentially unstoppable, and then he loses in a confusing way at WrestleMania, it undercuts everything. The entrance was incredible, the Jack in the Box, the theatrics, but the match didn't match that energy.
Let's talk about the production side for a second. Wade Keller at PW Torch did a full audio review covering production values specifically. What did that surface?
Keller's review on PW Torch covered the full show rundown with star ratings, thoughts on production values, the handling of the rain delay, the unscripted interviews during the delay, and the announcing. The fact that he dedicated a 46-minute audio episode specifically to those production elements tells you how much there was to unpack beyond just the matches.
The rain delay interviews being unscripted is fascinating. That's WWE having to improvise on the biggest stage of the year.
And TJR Wrestling's John Canton noted that Michael Cole didn't even specify how long the delay would be, just said it would be a few moments. Shane McMahon was interviewed backstage by Sarah Schreiber during the delay. It was genuinely uncharted territory for WrestleMania.
Okay, so stepping back from all of this, what's the overall verdict on WrestleMania 37 as an event?
It's a genuinely mixed bag in the best possible way. You have two main events that critics called all-time level matches. You have a historic cultural moment with Belair and Banks. You have Bad Bunny exceeding all expectations. And then you have the Orton-Finn match, which was a real low point. It's not a perfect show, but it's a significant one.
And the podcast community clearly agrees it's worth talking about. 520 podcasts worth of conversation.
That number is really telling. When you look at Ivy.fm's data showing 807 episodes covering WrestleMania 37, that's not just fans recapping results. That's a community processing a shared experience, the return of live wrestling, the historic moments, the debates about format and booking decisions.
The two-night format debate. Is one I want to come back to for a second, because W2M Network specifically debated whether WrestleMania should be 2 nights or 1. What's the actual argument against 2 nights?
The argument is essentially that spreading the card across 2 nights dilutes the stakes. When you have 7 matches per night instead of 10 or 11 in one night, each match theoretically gets more time and attention. But you also risk having nights that feel uneven, where one night is clearly stronger than the other.
And in WrestleMania 37's case, Night 1 had the more historic main event, but Night 2 had the more critically acclaimed one.
Exactly. Which is actually a pretty good argument for 2 nights. You get 2 distinct main event moments instead of 1. But the counter argument is that it also means you get 2 nights worth of undercard matches that might not all land. The Orton-Fiend match being on Night 2 is a good example of that.
So here's what this really comes down to. WrestleMania 37 is a show that delivered where it mattered most and stumbled where it had the most to prove.
That's a really clean way to put it. The Belair-Banks main event on Night 1 was historic and delivered. The Reigns-Edge-Bryan main event on Night 2 was called all-time level by CBS Sports. Those are the moments people remember. The Fiend match is the asterisk.
And the context around the whole event, the return of fans, the Peacock debut, the weather delay, adds this layer of significance that goes beyond just the matches.
Completely. TJR Wrestling's John Canton framed it perfectly. WrestleMania 37 was a big deal because it was the first time WWE was in front of a big crowd of fans for the first time in over a year. That emotional weight shaped everything about how the show felt, both in the stadium and watching at home.
And for anyone who wants to go back and watch it now, the Revisiting the Mania podcast's framing of which matches are worth watching and which ones you can skip is actually a really useful guide.
It is. Based on everything the podcast community has said, the clear must-watches are Bianca Belair versus Sasha Banks, the Roman Reigns triple threat, and the Bad Bunny match. The Fiend match is optional at best. Cesaro versus Seth Rollins is worth your time. Podcasts. A 57-year-old man who hadn't set foot in a wrestling ring in 19 years walked out at AT&T Stadium in Dallas, Texas, and headlined the biggest wrestling show on the planet, and the crowd absolutely lost their minds. Today, we're breaking down WrestleMania 38, what went down across both nights, which moments actually delivered, and how the wrestling podcast world responded in real time. By the end of this episode, you'll have a clear picture of what made this 2-night event tick, which matches are worth going back for, and why reviewers were split on whether Night 2 could ever match Night 1. Joining me to dig into all of it is someone who has been deep in the WrestleMania 38 coverage. Let's get into it. So, let's just set the scene first, because the scale of this thing is easy to underestimate. WrestleMania 38 was a 2-night event. Night 1 on Saturday, April 2nd, Night 2 on Sunday, April 3rd, both at AT&T Stadium in Arlington, Texas. And according to TJR Wrestling's review, the total runtime was nearly 8 hours of content across both nights.
8 hours. That is a lot of wrestling. It really is. And it was available on Peacock in the US and on the WWE Network internationally. Michael Cole opened the show screaming the word "stupendous" as loud as he possibly could, which honestly kind of set the tone for the whole weekend.
Very on brand for WrestleMania. So walk me through Night 1. What was actually on the card?
Night 1 had a pretty stacked lineup. You had the Usos defending the SmackDown Tag Team titles against Shinsuke Nakamura and Rick Boogs, Drew McIntyre versus Happy Baron Corbin, Logan Paul and The Miz taking on Rey and Dominic Mysterio, And then the Raw Women's title match, Bianca Belair challenging Becky Lynch.
And Bianca won that one, right?
She did. According to the Going in Raw podcast review, Bianca Belair finally beat Becky Lynch for the WWE Raw Women's Championship. That was a big deal. The Going in Raw guys spent a significant chunk of their 50-minute review on that match alone.
And then there was the SmackDown Women's title match too, Ronda Rousey versus Charlotte Flair.
Right, that was also on night one. ProWrestling.net's audio review, which ran 70 minutes, by the way, covered that match as one of the key bouts of the night alongside the Austin segment.
Okay, so let's talk about the elephant in the room, Steve Austin, because that's the one everyone was talking about.
Yeah, and it's wild when you actually think about what WWE did here. Kevin Owens hosted the KO show with Steve Austin as his special guest. That was the billing. But it turned into an actual match. And according to the Going in Raw review, this was Steve Austin's first match in 19 years.
19 years, and they put him in the main event slot of night one.
Exactly. And the crowd reaction was apparently enormous. The WrestleView Live podcast, which went live right after night one ended, specifically highlighted Austin's return as the centerpiece of the night. Mike Tedesco and the team broke it down as one of the defining moments of the whole weekend.
There's something almost poetic about that, right? Like, WWE essentially said, our biggest night of the year, night one of WrestleMania, and we're anchoring it on nostalgia on a guy who hasn't competed in nearly 2 decades.
And it paid off. That's the thing. The podcast community's reaction was overwhelmingly positive on that segment. The Going in Raw guys dedicated a huge portion of their review to it. You can see in their timestamps that the Austin versus Owens section starts at around the 32-minute mark of a 50-minute episode.
So that's night one. What about night two? Because from what I've seen, the reaction there was a little more complicated.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really interesting. The Getting Over Wrestling podcast on Audible, which ran 1 hour and 45 minutes for their Night 2 review alone, described Night 2 as having some spectacular moments, but struggling to live up to the high bar set by Night 1.
Wait, so night two, which had the main event of Roman Reigns versus Brock Lesnar, couldn't match night one?
That's what the Getting Over hosts Adam Silverstein and Chris Vanini concluded. And they specifically asked the question, did WWE get the booking right for the Reigns versus Lesnar Championship Unification match? Because that was billed as the biggest WrestleMania match of all time.
The biggest WrestleMania match of all time. That is a lot of pressure to put on one match.
It really is. And when you bill something that way, you're setting an almost impossible standard. The Getting Over podcast's take was essentially that the night had highlights, but the overall package didn't quite clear the bar night one had set.
So what were the highlights of night two that did land?
A few things. Edge versus AJ Styles was described as a dream match, 2 legends finally getting their WrestleMania moment together. Then you had the Anything Goes match between Johnny Knoxville and Sami Zayn, which the Getting Over podcast noted popped the crowd with the Jackass crew involved.
Johnny Knoxville from Jackass at WrestleMania in an Anything Goes match.
Yes, and apparently it worked as a spectacle. The celebrity crossover element was a big part of Night 2's identity. Pat McAfee also competed. He went against Austin Theory. And Steve Austin actually came back out on night 2 as well for a final moment with Vince McMahon, according to the Getting Over review.
Okay, so Austin showed up on both nights. That's kind of remarkable.
It is. And then there was Sasha Banks getting her first WrestleMania win in the women's tag team title match. That was a 4-way with Natalya and Shayna Baszler, Liv Morgan and Rhea Ripley, Naomi and Sasha Banks, and Carmella and Queen Zelina Vega. The Getting Over podcast flagged that as a notable moment for Sasha specifically.
And Triple H made a surprise appearance too, right?
He did, according to the Getting Over review. That was tied to the Edge and AJ Styles match, which had a whole storyline around it. So Night 2 had genuine moments. It just couldn't replicate the emotional peak that Austin's return created on Night 1.
Let me ask you something, because I think this is worth sitting with. The fact that Night 1 outshone Night 2 is kind of a reversal of how WrestleMania usually works, isn't it? Like, traditionally the Sunday night is supposed to be the crown jewel.
That's a really sharp observation. And I think it speaks to something specific about what WWE did with the 2-night format. They put their most emotionally resonant moment, Austin's return, on Night 1, and then tried to close Night 2 with the biggest title match. But the emotional ceiling had already been hit.
So the booking decision to put Austin on Night 1 might have actually worked against Night 2 in terms of audience perception.
Potentially, yeah. And that's the kind of thing the podcast reviewers were wrestling with, no pun intended. The Getting Over team spent a significant portion of their hour and 45-minute episode on exactly that question.
Speaking of the podcast coverage, let's talk about that for a second, because the sheer volume of audio content that came out of this weekend is kind of staggering.
It really is. You had ProWrestling.net's Jason Powell, Jake Barnett, and Will Pruitt putting out a 70-minute audio review of Night 1 alone. Going In Raw did a 50-minute episode, WrestleView went live immediately after Night 1 ended, and then Getting Over on Audible did 1 hour and 45 minutes just for Night 2.
That's almost 4 hours of podcast content just from those shows, for one weekend of wrestling.
Which tells you something about how much there was to unpack, and each show approached it differently. Going In Raw broke it down match by match with timestamps. You can literally jump to the Cody Rhodes versus Seth Rollins section if that's what you want. ProWrestling.net went deeper on the storytelling and booking angles.
Wait, Cody Rhodes versus Seth Rollins, that was the mystery opponent match, right? Where Vince McMahon chose Seth's opponent?
Exactly. And the reveal was Cody Rhodes returning to WWE after years away. According to the Going In Raw review, that was one of the biggest moments of Night 1. They dedicated a substantial section of their episode to it, starting around the 20-minute mark.
So you had Cody Rhodes returning, Steve Austin returning, Triple H appearing. This was basically a nostalgia and surprise machine.
And that's not a criticism necessarily. WWE leaned into the spectacle element hard, and the podcast community's reaction suggests it largely worked. The Cultaholic Wrestling Podcast, which has nearly 1 million subscribers on YouTube, dedicated their episode that week to asking what the best match of the entire WrestleMania 38 weekend was, which is a great framing because it acknowledges there were multiple contenders.
And what was the answer? What was the best match?
The Cultaholic episode didn't give us a definitive answer in the search results, but the fact that they framed the whole episode around that debate tells you there were genuine contenders. Edge versus AJ Styles, Bianca versus Becky, Cody versus Seth, all of those were in the conversation.
Let me bring up something that I think is a bit of an underrated angle here, the celebrity involvement. Because Logan Paul was on this card, Johnny Knoxville was on this card, Pat McAfee actually competed. That's a lot of non-wrestlers in prominent spots.
And the podcast community had mixed feelings about that. The Getting Over review specifically noted that the celebrity appearances popped the crowd. So in the arena, it worked. But whether it holds up as quality wrestling content is a different question.
Right, there's a difference between a crowd-pleasing moment and a match you'd go back and rewatch.
Exactly. And I think that tension between spectacle and substance is kind of the defining debate around WrestleMania 38 in the podcast world. The TJR Wrestling Review by John Canton, which covered both nights in detail, noted that the event had a runtime of nearly 8 hours. That's a lot of content, and not all of it can be at the same level.
Can we talk about the Pat McAfee thing for a second? Because that's genuinely one of the more bizarre career trajectories in recent memory.
Oh, absolutely. Pat McAfee was an NFL punter, then he became a sports media personality, then he became a WWE commentator, and according to the TJR Wrestling Review, WrestleMania 38 was his first WrestleMania as an announcer. And then he also competed in a match against Austin Theory on Night 2.
So he was both calling the show and performing in it. That's wild.
And the TJR review noted he was doing his usual dancing routine on the commentary table during the opening match. So he was fully in character from the jump. It's one of those things that only WWE can pull off with a straight face.
And the intro video was narrated by Mark Wahlberg, who used to be a rapper. So you had Marky Mark narrating WrestleMania. Just another Tuesday for WWE.
The TJR review specifically mentioned that Mark Wahlberg narrated the intro and appeared in it. And the show opened with country music singer Brantley Gilbert performing America the Beautiful. So before a single match happened, you already had a country singer, a former rapper turned actor, and Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders dancing to Thunderstruck by AC/DC.
That is a sentence I did not expect to say today. Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders dancing to Thunderstruck at WrestleMania.
And the TJR review's take on it was simply no complaints there, which I think is the correct response.
Okay, let's zoom out a little, because I want to talk about what the podcast coverage of WrestleMania 38 actually tells us about how wrestling fans engage with this kind of event.
That's a great question. And I think the answer is that wrestling fans are incredibly analytical. The Going In Raw podcast had timestamps for every single match segment. ProWrestling.net ran 70 minutes of detailed breakdown. These aren't casual recaps, they're deep dives.
It's almost like a film criticism community, right? Where the event itself is just the starting point for the real conversation.
That's a really good analogy. And the fact that multiple shows, WrestleView went live immediately after Night 1, Getting Over recorded within minutes of Night 2 ending, shows that the community wants that instant analysis. They want to process it together in real time.
And the debate about whether Night 2 lived up to Night 1, that's the kind of thing that keeps those conversations going for days.
Weeks, even. The Cultaholic episode asking about the best match of the weekend came out on April 8th, almost a week after the event. The conversation doesn't end when the show goes off the air.
Let me push back on something slightly, because there's an argument that a 2-night WrestleMania is just too much content. 8 hours is a lot to ask of any audience. Do the podcast reviewers address that?
Implicitly, yes. The Getting Over podcast's framing that Night 2 struggled to match Night 1 kind of acknowledges that fatigue is a factor. When you've already had Austin's return, Cody's return, Bianca's title win, and Rousey versus Charlotte all on Night 1, it's genuinely hard to top that.
So the 2-night format might actually be working against itself in some ways.
That's the tension. You get more content, more matches, more moments, but you also dilute the impact of any single moment. And when Night 1 front-loads the emotional peaks, Night 2 is always going to be playing catch-up.
And yet the Roman Reigns versus Brock Lesnar unification match, billed as the biggest WrestleMania match of all time, was on Night 2. So WWE clearly believed Night 2 had the bigger match on paper.
Right, and that's the fascinating disconnect. On paper, Reigns versus Lesnar for both titles is the marquee match. But in terms of emotional resonance, Steve Austin coming back after 19 years hit differently. The Getting Over podcast's conclusion was essentially that the booking was debatable. Did WWE get it right? They weren't sure.
That uncertainty is kind of the most honest take you can have, honestly.
And it's what makes the podcast coverage so valuable. These aren't press releases, they're genuine wrestling fans working through their reactions in real time. The ProWrestling.net team, the Going In Raw guys, the Getting Over hosts, they're all asking the same questions the audience is asking.
Okay, so here's what I want to know. If someone is going back to WrestleMania 38 now, what should they actually prioritize watching based on what the podcast community said?
Based on the coverage, the Steve Austin and Kevin Owens segment is non-negotiable. That's the emotional centerpiece of the whole weekend. Bianca Belair versus Becky Lynch got significant attention from Going In Raw as a standout match. And Cody Rhodes versus Seth Rollins was clearly a major talking point given how much time the reviewers spent on it.
And on Night 2?
Edge versus AJ Styles for the dream match factor. And the Knoxville versus Zayn Anything Goes match, if you want pure entertainment value, the Getting Over podcast noted it popped the crowd. And sometimes that's exactly what you need from a WrestleMania match.
So, when you step back from all of this, the 2 nights, the nearly 8 hours, the podcast community's reaction, what does WrestleMania 38 actually represent?
I think it represents WWE at a crossroads between nostalgia and the future. You had Steve Austin, the past, headlining Night 1. You had Cody Rhodes, who would go on to become one of WWE's biggest stars, making his return. You had Roman Reigns consolidating his position as the top guy. It was a show that was simultaneously looking backward and forward.
And the podcast community captured that tension really well. The debate about whether Night 2 matched Night 1 is really a debate about whether the future can match the past.
That's exactly it. And the fact that reviewers from ProWrestling.net to Getting Over to Going In Raw to Cultaholic were all wrestling with that same question across hours of audio content tells you this wasn't just a wrestling show. It was a cultural moment for the WWE fan base.
Here's what this really comes down to. WrestleMania 38 gave the wrestling world almost too much to talk about, and the podcast community rose to meet it.
70-minute reviews, hour and 45-minute breakdowns, live reactions immediately after the show, the coverage matched the scale of the event. And the central question that keeps coming up across all of it is whether Night 1's emotional peak was a feature or a bug for the overall weekend.
And honestly, the fact that we're still asking that question is probably the best thing you can say about a wrestling show.
A show that doesn't make you argue about it afterward isn't worth watching. WrestleMania 38 absolutely made people argue. The Cody Rhodes return, the Austin match, the Reigns versus Lesnar booking, all of it is still debated. That's the mark of an event that actually mattered.
And if you want to go deep on any of it, podcast coverage is genuinely excellent. Going in Raw's timestamped breakdown, ProWrestling.net's 70-minute audio review, Getting Over's instant analysis on Audible, there's no shortage of places to go.
And the WWE podcast on Spotify even did a throwback episode revisiting Night 1 specifically. So the conversation around WrestleMania 38 has genuinely had staying power. It's not just a show people watched and moved on from.
Which brings us back to where we started. A 57-year-old who had